Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about wrongful termination and whether wrongful termination can constitute a tort instead of a breach of contract. This is one of the areas that has been most hard fought by the plaintiff's bar to transform most or perhaps all wrongful terminations into torts. And you have to begin with a recognition that in California, as in most states, most employees are at-will employees. That is, their employment contract is such that they don't have any contractual protection from being discharged. In an at-will contract, either party can terminate that contract without cause at any time. Now, what of course happens is an employee is working in a business and things seem to be going well, and then perhaps for reasons unrelated even to performance, it may simply be that the supervisor just decides, I'm just not getting along with you anymore, or you get a new supervisor who says, I don't get along with you, or other reasons. The company decides to terminate you. Well, that employee may want to then sue to recover damages for wrongful termination. The question is, when can you do that, given that you're an at-will employee? Now, the easy cases, conceptually, they're ones where you have some constitutional or statutory protection. For example, where the reason for the adverse employment action is something that a statute proscribes. So, obviously, under both federal and state law, you may not discriminate in employment on the basis of race or gender or certain other characteristics. And if you violate those statutes, the type of liability that is imposed tends to be tort-like liability. So if you violate a statute or a constitutional provision as an employer, you're going to be held liable not in contract, but under the statute, and you are very likely to be held then liable for tort-like liabilities. All right, let's assume though that we don't have one of those cases. Then the cases begin to get a lot closer. The easiest ones, where courts have held, yes, there still is a tort, are cases where it is a termination in violation of public policy. A termination in violation of public policy. Now, the question that you immediately have is, well, what public policy are you talking about? In California, what the courts have done is they've said, well, this is a type of termination where you've been terminated for a reason that, although not directly proscribed by a statute, nevertheless seems to be contrary to a fairly clearly established public policy that we can trace back to some statute or to a constitutional provision. An easy example of a violation of a wrongful termination in violation of public policy is the following scenario. The employer says to the employee, I want you to help us fix prices in this market. And so I want you to call up your counterpart at a competitor and see if we can fix prices. And the employee says, well, I'm not going to do that. That's criminal. It violates the antitrust laws, federal and state. It'll expose the company to civil liability. It can expose us to criminal prosecution, so I won't do it. And the company says, well, thank you, you are hereby terminated. Now, there's not a statute that exists that specifically and expressly says that's wrongful termination. But it clearly is contrary to public policies against price fixing, public policies against criminal conduct. And if you are then terminating somebody who has refused to engage in criminal conduct, courts are going to treat that as a tort. And again, that's not because you've really breached the employment contract, it's because courts have been able to find a strong public policy that you have breached. Not exactly one expressly in a statute, but close enough for the courts to find that that is tortious. Once you go beyond the violation of public policy, then it starts to be very difficult to find tort liability and wrongful termination. That's when courts in California and elsewhere typically fall back and say, well, no, your contract actually is at will, and you may be alleging bad faith, you may be alleging that they've terminated you out of spite and malice. You can add all of the adjectives you'd like, but it still is not tortious. It's basically a contract type claim, so you're not going to be able to turn that into a tort. Now, how can you turn that into at least a breach of contract? Well, the answer is that even though you're at will, there are at least two ways in which you can still have contract liability when you're discharged. The first is the employer, over the course of your employment, may have given you all sorts of oral assurances that you're doing a great job. And so long as you continue doing a great job, you'll have a long career here at this company. Courts will sometimes interpret that type of statement, if it's repeated a lot, if you see it in a lot of places, those sort of positive encouragement, they will sometimes interpret that as actually modifying the contract, so that it no longer becomes just an at-will contract. They've actually promised you that they'll keep you so long as you continue to perform well. Well, then the employment contract actually has been, as a practical matter, modified orally, and if they then breach you for no reason at all, or breach you in bad faith, a court can say there's been a breach of the contract, because we've decided the contract actually changed. Another provision that is oftentimes used for this is the covenant of good faith and fair dealing. Now, that's a covenant that you all may recall from contracts, exists in every contract. Every contract has this covenant. It's basically a covenant that says neither party will do something deliberately to undermine the ability of the other party to perform. That when you enter into a contract, you're supposed to try, by and large, to perform. Now, I should make it clear, the covenant does not take away from either party the power deliberately to breach. But it is a covenant that prevents a certain amount of bad faith conduct. Nevertheless, the breach of the covenant is a breach of a contract covenant and does not lead to tort liability as a general matter, and certainly doesn't do it in the context of wrongful termination. Although the language of bad faith is something that some courts used, particularly early in the 1980s, to say, well, maybe we'll treat this as a tort. Very good. That's all we have, I think, for wrongful termination at this point. Continue on with the reading, and I'll see you next time.